So it's on length the Shitta of the Mukavalim Rishonim, and we reached the Maskana particularly in the light of the Avodas HaKodesh, in the name of the Ramban, that they hold that the Keser, or what they call in the name of the Rambam Mipanot, the Rotzen HaKadmain. Then we saw that Rotzen, or that Keser, what they held was a Madrega Ein Seif, was Kadmain Kekadmas Ein Seif, even though it was Olu Min Ein Seif. So we saw that represented a question: how can something which is Mamish Olu Mimenu, how can it be described as Kikadmusai, Kadmain Kekadmusai? And we saw that the Rebbe said that Mishum Shaloi Hoya Zman Shaloi Hoya Horotzen. So we discussed it at some length at the end of the last year, how that fits into the Maimon Chazal in the Pirchei de Rabbi Eliezer, Ad Shaloi Hoya, Ad Shaloi Nivro Ho'ilam, Hoya Hu Shmei Bilvad. We saw how that maybe can be more foolish, Lefi the Lashon of the Pirchei de Rabbi Eliezer. The Haramak Choylek al Zeh, we saw that the Ramak differed with that, because he held that ein litain shum kadmus v'shum dover hanimtzu mimena only to the Eibishter himself, and v'chein hu bi emes. And we saw that the Alter Rebbe, he holds a different shitta, and he held that there was what we call a amshocha v'gilui. That's not Kadmain Kikadmusa Yisbara. And that's called Oyer. That's what it's how he understands the Lashon of the Rizal and the Mukabolim that came out of the Rizal Lashon for Oyer. And he said that Oyer, which was Bob Gilui from the Atzmas. Now we'll soon see what's the difference between Oyer Bob Gilui and Oyer which is Kolob Atzmus. Loi mipnei shehu b'chinas kadmas chas v'sholem, to say that, ki im mipnei shehu me'ein hamoyer. So we were conducting in that whole concept of me'ein, even though, as we pointed out, the Lashon of the Alter Rebbe is ke'ein, not with the mem, but anyway, we have to assume that the kavanah is the same. V'lochein u mahave b'koyach le'ein seif. And we saw that the Hisavas is dafke from that oil, not from the Atzmas itself, but dafke from the oil. But the oil is only a dovish olu mimenu or nimshach mimenu. It's not kadmus ke kadmusai, and it's only the koyach ein seif, which is literally behelim betoicha oil, and that's alidei the concept of me'ein, or dafke alidei there. Is the Hisavas. If according to the Alter Rebbe, we avoid the problem of saying that the intermediary madrega between the Ein Seif, between the Atzmas and the Hisavas of the Bria Yesh Mi'ayin is Kadman Kekadmusai.
Why is it that with the early Mukabalim, why is it that this whole svara that why is it that their whole svara, why does that make it that they can't call the Atzmus Ein Sof?
Why they can't call the Oyer Atzmus Ein Sof?
Why can't they call Atzmus Ein Sof just because of their svara? Why can't they call Atzmus Ein Sof?
Why can't they call Atzmus Ein Sof? Well, I mean, they do. They say that there is Atzmus Ein Sof. And then there's a Nivroim. But they say in the middle there's a Madrega called Shmoi, or Retainer. And that's like a madrega between the Atzmas and the Nivroim. Well, about it, they say that there is such a thing as Atzmas. So therefore, that's the shitta of the Alter Rebbe. Now, that's what we were holding. We were holding at the beginning of Kuf Samach Tes, right? Right near the top?
Yeah.
Right. V'zehu ma shechidesh Rabbeinu nishmas Eiden. And this is what the Alter Rebbe, Rabbeinu nishmas Eiden, refers to the Alter Rebbe. This is the thing that he brought, the new idea and the new chiddush that he brought into the whole inyan. The ha'oyer nikra ein seif, that the can be given that name Ein Sof with all the inner pirushim and perfection that we saw in the word Ein Sof, all that can be given into the Oyer. Mipnei shehu meyein hamoya. In other words, with all that wondrous concept of meyein and all that implies, like we discussed at length in the previous classes, with that the Alter Rebbe literally earns the two extremities. On the one hand, he says that the Oyer is only a Olam Mimenu, that was not Kadmin Kikab Musay, and it's only a Ha'ora Mimenu Bovad, it's not Atzmusay Chlau, and it's B'derech Chidush, Ha'ora Shehoyele Zman Sheloyo Kodmoy Heder, therefore it's not Kadmus. Afu Pikein, it davki through the medium of the Oyer is the Yisavas. The Mutari avoids saying that the Yisavas was Alidei Ha'atzmus Mamish. And yet on the other hand, the Oyer is only a Olu Mimenu, but the Svara Maftechi, the key Svara of the Alter Rebbe is this idea of Me'ein HaMo'oyer. And we saw that BMS, the Me'ein HaMo'oyer is dependent in another factor or Svara, and that's what we called the Veikis BeHaMo'oyer. And that's a concept of Oyer. That's the Hemshech and the Shleimas of the marshal of Oyer, in that Oyer is Dovuk BeHaMo'oyer, until the whole Metzias of Oyer is only Shaykh when there's the Mo'oyer, and it's only Shaykh mitzad the Devekis in the Mo'oyer. And therefore mitzad that Devekis there comes as a Hemshech and a Teitzor from that fact, or that factor, Me'ein HaMo'oyer, Ve'ilu, on the other side, Le'iduk Isa, it has absolutely no erech whatsoever cloud to the Mo'oyer, and it's only an Olu Mimenu Yisbora. The HaMukubalim Harishonim, because if we compare those Mukubalim Harishonim to the Alter Rebbe, then Daitom, the Shmoi, Shehu HaRotzen, Hu Ein Sof Mitzad Atzmoi Kanal. We saw that the whole differing factor between the Mukubalim Harishonim and the Alter Rebbe is that they hold that the Indian of Shmoi, based on the Maimon of Pirkei Rebbe Lezer, who Shmoi Bilvad, the Ramah Mipano called that Rotzen, and like we saw, Shmoi is Begematria Rotzen. They said that the Ein Sof, which is in that Be'etzem, Mitzad Atzmoi. All the Pirushim that we were Mavaya in the term Ein Sof are to be found in that Gilui Mimenu called Shmoi or Rotzen, in a Eifen Atzmi, not like the Alter Rebbe that he says that the Oyer itself is only a Ha'ora and it's a Dover She'eshli Tichlo, but Mitzad the Devekis and the Me'ein HaMo'oyer, it's got the Koyach of the Ein Sof. Ve'ila, these Mukubalim HaRishonim, they have the opinion that Madrega, what they call Shmoi, or Keser, well, that has the Indian for Ein Sof, with all the Pirushim that we said in it, in its own right, not mitzad the Devekis in the Mo'oyer, but in itself, it has in itself the Indian of Ein Sof. The Rabbeinu Chiddush, and the Alter Rebbe brought a new Chiddush into the whole Indian, the Shmoi Hu Oyer. The Alter Rebbe said that concept of Shmoi is the idea of Oyer. For who Ein Sof loy mitzad atzmi, and it Taka has the perfection of the concept of Ein Sof, but not in its own right. Ki mitzad haMo'oyer da'ainu shehu me'ein haMo'oyer. Now, why would the Alter Rebbe teach that the Indian from Shmoi is Oyer? Actually, Nivro ha'olam hoyer hu Shmoi bilvad. So the Ramah, B'derech Remez at the beginning, but then Derech Shita, he said Shmoi is Begematria Rotzen. That afar, but that Indian from hoyer hu Shmoi bilvad indicates an Indian from Rotzen. And for the reasons we pointed out much earlier in these classes, the Alter Rebbe wants to avoid calling that by the name Rotzen. Even though, we'll see as we go along, there are certain traces which border on a concept of Rotzen in that Indian, in that Gilui, but the Amitis Agilui is not yet rotten, because rotten is already a hamshocha towards, which indicates that there's already a specific kavana, or there's some goal or some inyan that we're looking for, which somehow or another defines the etzim hamshocha. Therefore, when you say rotzen, you mean already a certain definitive or defined derivation of the nefesh towards a certain inyan. So the same Lamaila we would have to say that if we say rotzen. And Afar says the Alter Rebbe that what the Pirchei the Rebbe Eliezer says Hoyehu Shmoi, then that is referring to a concept called Oyer, to this whole wondrous idea of light. Now, why would he say that Shmoi is only, or Shmoi is the infant Oyer? Why would the Alter Rebbe time that? Even though the emes is, we're only talking here in a definitional general way. There are certain drushim and siddur, but they make differences between Shmoi and Oyer. In a very deeply defined way, you can't always equalize Shem with Oyer. Sometimes Oyer and Shem have differing as far as in siddur. However, here Be'evan Kloli, if we talk about the Giluyim from the Ein Seif prior to the Tzimtzum, then the Alter Rebbe says that Shmoi is Oyer, and the reason for that is that if we look at the concept of a name, then we see that a name is not in any way the essence of the thing. For example, we take a name of a person, then the name is not his essence by any means. The name is only if you don't mind, I don't like people sitting with drawing room poses during the classes, if you don't mind. So you have to sit, well, you have to find yourself a chair, and you have to find yourself a table, and you have to prepare yourself, but I don't like people sitting with that type of drawing room pose, if you don't mind. I'm not suggesting that you weren't paying attention, but everything has got its particular. For example, in the army, when you go to stand to the parade, you can have the best of kavanas. You can say that you are a wonderful soldier and you are better than everybody, but you got to stand the way everybody else stands. You got to do it in a certain disciplined way, and doubtless, doubtless that also has its milas, also benegir to pinimis advarim. Anyway, Shmoi and Oyer are the same inyan. The name of a person is not by any means his essence, because we could imagine a person living without a name. We can imagine him just having been born on a desert isle or something, and everybody left him, and he just grew up with and he wasn't ever given a name. We can imagine him living without a name. So the emes is that in Pnimis Adorim you can't really say that he doesn't have a name. He does. It's just that they didn't call his name Begoloi. Over the emes is he has, the Alter Rebbe is mavaya that in Likutei Torah and Parsha Bolok, which is not that far away from where we are now. It's hopefully Moshiach will intercept us before we get to Parsha Bolok, and we'll learn Parsha Bolok with Moshiach Tzidkenu together. However, over there in Parsha Bolok, the Alter Rebbe is mavaya that the name, the inyan from Shem, does exist by everybody, because the name which you have is a form of Hamshocha and Gilui of the Oyer HaNeshama, which is too high to enter the body exactly as it is. The way it comes in and enters the body and is mechaya the body at close range, you might call it, but derech hislapshus, well, that is through the name that you have. Therefore, you must have a name, and the person who doesn't have a name, he really does, but he just doesn't know what it is. And so therefore, Lefi Seh is very understandable, and it comes out very well what the famous beer of the Mezritch Magid, what he gave over in the name of the Arizal, what he said, that when parents call a name at a bris, that is a nevuah ktana. So what's the difference between a nevuah ktana and a nevuah gedela is interesting to be misbainan. Of al chapanim, it's a nevuah, it's a geder of nevuah, and therefore it's well known that you must never interfere with the parents when they call the name. You must always let them make their own decision in reference to the name. Therefore, the Rebbe wrote on many occasions in the letters, you must always let the parents themselves decide what is the name, and you shouldn't come along and boss them around and give them all sorts of instructions. Say you want the child to be called this and that and something else. There'll be a family crisis if you don't call him by the Zayder and the Baba. So Ma'atayv Manoim that you should call, but that has to be left to the parents. If they decide that, then that's the way it is. And Lefi Zeh Yuvan, because really when the parents give a name, they are what you might call a Maila Mi'ateva, touching on that name which Balavochi is there. In other words, the name is a thing which is there. You've just got to get at it and find what it is. And what is the purpose of bringing it out into Golui? That helps and assists by calling it Begolui, that's a infant further Hamshocha into a Madrega Peshuta in its relationship to the Guf. And it also assists in all sorts of ways at which when a person hears his name called, that it affects him, which means that the name does really have a certain connection with a very important aspect of the person. However, on the other hand, it's only a ha'ora mimeno. It's not really his very essence or the etzem of his neshama. It's only a gilu, a certain medium being used to help the neshama affect the guf and to carry out its islapshus in the guf. And is that on the one hand, the inif and shame is an important gilui of the person, has an important reference to him. On the other hand, it's not him at all, and it can only be called a ha'ora bilvad. So that's what the Alter Rebbe is saying, that the concept of shame has in it those inyonim. Mitzad echad, it's only a ha'ora bilvad. Mitzad hasheni, it does have a certain close connection with the inyan apnimiyot and with certain inyonim which are neged to more achmistic chayas of the man, or life of the man. That's the idea of calling the gilui mimenu is bar, but there are ha'ora of calling it shmoy, or in his language calling it oya. And so therefore he teaches that you don't have to say that shmoy is the inyan from Rotz and Mamish. No, you can say that shmoy is the inyan from oya. Not according to those Mukabalim Rishonim, it's not Ein Seif mitzad itself. In its own right does it have the inyan from Ein Seif. Ki im mitzad ha-moer. It's only mitzad da'aynu shu mi'eina moer. Mitzad this wondrous svara. The Alter Rebbe is mechadish that there is mi'ein ha-moer. V'yesh ba oer. He says, Rebbe, the truth of the matter is, we have to admit, Hainu ba'er akolu bi'atzmusai, in the which is kalul in the very essence of the Eibishter, as compared to what he said right at the first line, there's a abor b'gilui. In other words, that the Alter Rebbe says there are two madregas in this oyer, which is meya mi'ah atzmus. There's a inif an oyer which is meya b'golui mimenu, and then there's another oyer, Hainu ba'er akolu bi'atzmusai, another what you might call aspect of the oyer. It can't really be called a madrega, but an aspect of the oyer. But that's a bechina shu, bechinas kadmen kekadmusa is bara. He said, what ein nachanami you'll be able to say about that? Kadmen kekadmusa aval zehu masha ein bechinas metzius oyer klal u klal. Omamela lo yiksha al ze kushis aramachsal ukamashi yez a boer. So the Alter Rebbe said that is, even though we call it oyer, that's only just a Shem HaMushal. It's a borrowed name. It's not really oyer. And yet, on the other hand, it's not really the Atzmus Mamish either. It's not Mamish the Pshitas of the Atzmus, but it's called oyer hakolu bi'atzmus. Say on that, on that you can say kadmin Kadmusei, because there was never a point that wasn't there, because it's not really there. It's there, but it's not really. And that's what that's what the Alter Rebbe said, that it's not a metzius of oyer. Now the truth of the matter is that you can't really talk about oyer and that madrega being a metzius, because like we point out, the word metzius indicates a found and defined entity. What he means to say is, however much you can call oyer a matzir, however much oyer is some sort of entity, because it's been revealed via atzmas, this oyer which is kolol b'adam, you can't say that about it. So what we're doing then is like, once again, we're like having our cake and eat it too. On the one hand we're saying that it's oil, on the other hand we're saying that it's not oil. On the other hand it's not the atzmis, and this is really what you might call a headache which we don't really need to take on ourselves at this moment, because in the coming Maimah there's going to be, well, not the coming Maimah, but the Maimah after the coming Maimah, there's going to be quite a lengthy discussion about that, or what is that particular inyan. So maybe we'll leave it for to suffice it to say that you guys no doubt do your chittas or good Sachen. So just about a week ago in the chittas, or a few days ago in the chittas, we met up with this particular inyan, even though you may not have recognized it b'golui kokach, but it's there, and that's that the Alter Rebbe in Perik Gimel of Shara Yichav Amunah, the Alter Rebbe says that there are two madregas in the Oyer HaMeya Mia Hashemesh. He said there's the Oyer HaMeya Mia Hashemesh B'tei Cholol Ha'olam, it's in the whole, what you call space, or Cholol, how do you call it, the Cholol of space. And then he says that there's a Oyer HaKolol B'tei Guf Kadur Hashemesh. It's a Oyer which is entwined inside the very goof of the Shemesh. And he brings a Kal V'chema with that. And he says, She'im ha'oyer yochil lahoyer b'tei cholol ha'olam l'merachik b'tei cholol ha'olam Kal V'chema she'yochil lahoyer bim koimoy. He said, if it's able to be meir way out there in the cholol ha'olam, then it's a Kal V'chema that it must be able to be meir bim koimoy. In other words, mamish inside the guf kadur Hashem, there must be the also. You can't just say that it's only out there. And so, what does he mean by that, Alter Rebbe? He said, and then there's a Oyer which is Meir inside where the Shemesh in its own self. There's Meir Oyer, and that's B'der Kal V'chema. So the Shaila is, why did the Alter Rebbe need to bring a Kal? Why didn't he say Kal V'chema? He just said Yesh Oyer Kol B'tei Hashemesh, Yesh Oyer Meir B'Shemesh. Why did he have to go that way? Why did he have to say, that oil which is Meir out there? He said it can be Meir out in the Chol Kal V'chema She'yochel Lahoyer Bim Koimoy. So it's hard to say that the Inyan of the Kal V'chema is just to be mechazik the Inyan, just B'derech Kil Pilpul Haloshen. And with that, it's brought down in certain Drushei Chassidus, that with that the Alter Rebbe wants to hint that oil which is Kol Bim Koimoy is another type of oil altogether than the oil which is Meir B'tei Cholol Ha'olam, and therefore he uses the Kal V'chema, because Kal V'chema stresses you a great emphaticness in the thing that you learn out. You come to a thing, but there are Kal V'chema that it's got a certain Meila Gedoyla to it. So with that the Alter Rebbe tends to indicate, or wants to indicate, according to these Drushei Chassidus, that Oyer HaKol B'tei Guf Kadur HaShemesh, well, that's a much greater and more elevated form of Oyer, even compared to the Oyer which is Meir B'tei Cholol Ha'olam. Excuse me, if you want to come to the classes, you must come on time. Okay? Really. Is because what happens is when you come in, all the eyes sort of turn away, and everybody's misbehaving a little bit, and everybody's saying, well, what's he doing coming so right? And for about 2.5 minutes, all the minds drift ever so delicately, according to the discipline of the minds, it drifts ever so slightly from the Hemshech HaTorah. However, Lefi said that there is another type of oil, even though it's not really oil compared to that oil which is outside, inside the Cholol Hashem, inside the Kadur Hashem. As is Mavur you just had it about a week ago in the Chitat. So the Rebbe said the same Lamaila, and he said Ein Chanami, that's not really a Metzius of oil, and therefore it can be said that it's Kadman Kadmusa Yizborach. And we're going to see later on why we'll be able to say that. And that is because we meet up with the word that we met at the beginning of the last page, right near the top, and that was the word Yechoilas. And we already spoke about that briefly, that Yechilas is what you could do, really. What you could do, and that is a very elevated, almost unlimited, isn't it? What you could really do is unlimited. In other words, it's elevated and unlimited, and it's kol mitzad, and it's mitzad the mile of the etzem, and therefore it's called a Yechilas. On the other hand, that's not the pshitas of the atzmas, because immediately you say he could do this or he could do that. I mean, I don't know what. Then you're already to some extent going away from the etzem pshitas and the maila and the etzem have what you might call hafshota of the atzmas. Therefore, that's called oyer akol biat musay, and therefore that can be kadmin kekad musay, because what he could do, that is always there. That's always there mitzad the atzmas, and yet immediately you say something that the atzmas could do, then you've already gone down from the pshitas and the etzem of the atzmas. So therefore, we'll see about that more as we come along and as we go along in the drush what he mentions here, the Rebbe, but that's the drush of Ki Imcha Merkei Chaim. However, he said, אבל זה מה שאין מבחינת מציאס כלל. כלל, הוא אומר לו, לא יקשה על זה קושייס הרמ"ק. Therefore the Ramak, that he said you can't possibly say Kadman about anything except the Eibush to him, the Eibush himself. So he said, since this is kol b'toich atzmusay, and it's only a yechilas, it's only a oyer in the atzmus mamish, therefore that kasha won't be applicable anymore. In other words, we've got now two inyanim. Lefi Rabbeinu Zal. Yeah, the Alter Rebbe. We have the which is Meir Begolui, what they hindered in the brackets, and then we have the inyan of Kol Biat Musay. So they are Meir Mimenu, that's Mi'ain Hamoy, and that's the one who actually does the Yisavit. There's a Kol Biat Musay, but that's Kadman Kekad Musay. V'lachei. He said, Yeh boy, Val Yodei, he savas mi'ain le. She said, but since there's a which is mi'ain hamoya, and it's linked to the atzmas, even from dovuk, and therefore it's mi'ain hamoya, and therefore in that boy, Val Yodei, he savas mi'ain le. Yes, ve'im kol zeh, and nonetheless, einoi atzmas umahus haboyrei mamish, rak b'chidas hamshochas uir mimenu le. Levod. It's only an infant Amshochas Mimenu. But that's according to the Alter Rebbe, and to a certain extent, we're going to see from the brackets, it's also that general concept that the Atzmas himself is not the Mahave. No, there's a Madrega between the Atzmas and the Nivroim or the Mishavim Mimenu. Well, that everybody's masking. That was it. The Rebbe in the bracket of Ainu Pchinas HaRotzen Animtza Mimenu. Now that he's making it, you got to sort of keep your shoes on your toes here. Now he's referring back and taking into account what we saw in the shit of the Mukubalim HaRishonim. Ainu Pchinas Rotzen Animtza Mimenu. Shazo Pchinas Shmoy L'Da'atom Zal. According to the Mekubalim HaRishonim, that they said that there's also a bechina between the atzmas and the nivroim, which is bedugma and similar to the inyan of oyer, but according to them, it's not so much the inyan of an oyer per se, but it's either a rotzen or shmoy, because the Ramak said that shmoy is anyway begematria harot. Upiresh shmoy oyer. He said, according to everybody, to a certain extent, we have to say that shmoy means oyer. In other words, shmoy doesn't mean a completely other inyan. But, according to the Alter Rebbe, it means oyer in the pure concept and the pure idea of oyer, with all the, what you might call the purity of the marshal of oyer l'gabia amoya. As far as they're concerned, they would say that Einoch Hanami, it's a form of oyer, and that's why they call it shmoy, but it's a madrega of rotzen. According to the Ramami Pano, it's a inyan from rotzen, and according to the other Mukubalim, it's keser. And the truth of the matter is that they also admit that keser and rotzen are very close, one to the idea, because like we pointed out in the marshal of keser, also once the king puts on the crown, then that's his coronation. That makes him a king over the country. What that he didn't put on the crown? He's not a king yet. He's tremendous elevated being. Bli kesher im ha'am. What he puts on the crown, that to a certain extent gives him a certain gilui v'kesher klapei ha'am. Therefore, they also hold that the Inifin Kesser and Rotzen are connected. Not the Ramah, Mamish, the other Mekubalim Rishonim. However, all of them admit that to a certain extent that's connected with a union of Oyer, but it's either Kesser or Rotzen, which of course are Krivim Zeh. However, he said, Zeu Shechidush Rabbeinu Zal. He said, however, in that Loshen, Oyer, which can be connected with Shmoi, they hold that it's in Van Rotten. Came along the Alter Rebbe, and he gave in that a Chiddush. And the Alter Rebbe said that in Oyer, which is anyway connected with Shmoi, Yesh B'zeh Beish Madrega is Mashu Prinas Gilui, Hainu Gam Lifnei HaTzimtzum. When we say Gilui, we mean even before the Tzimtzum. Ve'al zeh eno shayach lo mekadmen chas v'sholom. And that's where he differs. They hold that madrega of Rotzen or Kesser is kadmon. Ki im mashu mi'ein hamoyer. It's this tremendous chiddush svara of the Alter Rebbe mein hamoyer. Va'beis, the second madrega in the Indian of Shmoi being connected with Oyer, is Oyer k'moshe korol bi'atzmusei mamish u'bebchina zu shayach lo mekadmen k'kadmusei yisborach u'k'moshe yes boya. That's going to be dealt with at much length, as we saw in the Drush ki imcha makir Chaim, which is not the coming Maimon but the one after. So everybody sort of beginning to think, well, Ad Motzai, when are we going to get to that particular Maimon? It's a good question, but we just have to keep, as a famous old quip has it, we just have to keep hammering along. However, the Mechubalim Rishonim, they at least have a certain revach, they also earn a certain good point, and of course the Alter Rebbe was machadish legabi dem, his chiddush, which meaning that everybody, including the Alter Rebbe, but the Alter Rebbe is a chiddush legabi them, which is the Mechubalim Rishonim. He said that they earned through that by saying that the Isavas was from Rotzen Akodom or from Kesser, which was Ein Sof Mitzad Tzveri. So they earned in that the Isavas is not from the very etzem of Atzmus Ein Sof himself, Mamish, the Yiksher Lefizeh, because you would immediately have a kasha according to that. Eich Loi Shonisi. How could you possibly say that the Eibishter didn't have any shinui whatsoever if he himself, as it were, was actually directly involved in the Etzem Isavas? Sha'arihu al-Koponi Mokela Oilamas. If you're going to say that the Atzmus himself brought about the Oilamas, then in some ways he's a mocker for them. If you're a mocker for something, you must have some form of relationship or kesher or ispilus or reckoning with it or admitting that it has a matzias or if you're a mocker for something, then you can't just shake it off. You can't just say, oh, it's not mine, I have nothing what to do with it, klal or klal. Edefer, that's what they were interested in, being maraviach, the Mekubalim Rishonim, and the Alter Rebbe, of course, with his great chiddush. They earned that you don't say that the Hisavas was directly from the Atzmas, mitzad the pasuk of Rosh Nisi, because if you do, then he's al koponim amokele velamas. Ule divreihem, but according to their opinion, that it was only from the Rotzen or the Kesser. Nicha, that at least is good. Nicha meaning ein kushia. Meaning nicha from Lashon Menucha in Aramic, meaning that it's good. Ein kushya. Sha'isavas hu mipchinas hakesser oya arotzen. The Isavas are not directly from the Eibishter. It's from a dovashe olu mimenu or al kaponim heir mimenu. Even from Ein Seif, but Ein Seif pure in the sense of it's Ein Seif mitzad atzmei, and that's either hakesser oya rotzen. Ulazo is beginners atmos haboiri is barak loy shonishi klau. And therefore they're able to rectify the fact that Einochanami, in the very essence of the boira himself, there's been no shinui whatsoever. Mipnei she'ena beginners mocker le'elamas ki im harotzen hanimto mimenu. What is a mocker for the elamas? Harotzen hanimto mimenu. So if there's any shaykhs, any kesher, any spilers, kosher, then it's legabi the rotzen bilvada, but not legabi the achmet. Amamela kumta is that in a way, to a certain extent, the word rotzen will be good, because rotzen implies that you want something. Amamela, that implies that there's a certain preparation for his pilot. But immediately you say that you are a being with a will, then that indicates that you are in some way shy to being either fulfilled your will or not. In other words, you have a will. As if you have a will, then that means that there's a fulfillment or otherwise of that will. And it comes to that the etzem getter of the word rotzen implies a certain readiness to what you might call a reaction or a hispilus. Therefore, they don't mind that there'll be a certain hispilus like Gabi the rotzen, but they take away the rotzen from the atzma. And they say it's not the atzmus which is being mispoiled, but it is the rotzen. And therefore, he said, the Ramah makes very careful reference to that particular point. In the Sefer that we quoted at the beginning, the Yod Neselim, and the other spot that we quoted from the Ramah, Shebechinas harotzen hanikra ein seif hu sibo reshina elanim toim she'ein sibo lamaylahi menu liyesh bechinas moke elanim toim. So therefore, said the Ramah, he comes up with a slightly new concept that we're moving into now, sibo, cause. And therefore he calls that rotzen, Akodom, he calls it the first cause. Now this is what you often hear in the words of the philosophers and the Lesugeim or Lemineim and all sorts of so-called rationalists and all sorts of peoples, what they throw around this idea of the first cause. Everything must go back to something which brought something about, and so therefore they call what they talk about the first cause. And so somebody want to say, well, maybe he's the first cause. So the Ramah says that there is a first cause, but the first cause is the rotzen, not the Eibishter Mamish. And now when he uses the word cause, sibo, we're going to see that is very meduyak. Of course, everything that these great people said was Baruch HaKodesh, whatever they said is B'tachas HaDiyuk. And when we say sibo, then we mean a cause in the pure sense of the word cause in English. However, not to be confused, klau, as we pointed out on numerous occasions, with the union of ilava Olul in certain great Makoiris in the Jewish Mukabalim and thinkers, that you don't the phrase Ilav Olul has nothing to do with cause. No, Ilav Olul means a thing which functions in its proper way. The Ilah, it gives forth, but Mamela from it, it's Alul. Mashenkin Sibo means Ador Rachok. A sibur is something which caused something to come about, but it doesn't really have any kasher with it. In other words, if it weren't there, or it wasn't what it is, or didn't do something, then maybe you might not have had the sibur that came out of it. But the sibur is not a direct olul from the mesuvav. The core, the effect is not a direct kasher with the cause. The cause and the effect are essential one to the other. If there hadn't been the cause, there wouldn't be an effect. But not that the effect and the cause are in any way intimately or be'erach linked one to the other. And therefore, the inyan cause, in the real sense, is distant by definition from its effect. Mashahin ilva ol are not, and ilva ol are not cause and effect. but Iliva Olu are derivative and source point. What am I? Source point and derivative. That's what is Iliva Olu. Okay, so therefore the Ramak is careful to say that this Madrege, what he calls the Rotzen HaKodum, right, he says that is called the Sibba, of the Sibba Rishoino, and he said she ain't Sibba Lamaila Mimenu liyosh bechinas moker animto. There's no Sibba higher than that Rotzen that could be a mocker to all the Nimtoim. Now he's going to earn a lot through that by calling it only a Sibba. Because with that he's also going to get rid of this whole problem of his pilers into reaction. Like we just said, a Sibba cannot necessarily be, not necessarily at all be linked by way of his pilers with its mesuvab, with its effect. And therefore he calls that the first Sibba. What about the Atzmas? So he says the Ramah a very interesting thing. He said, Mahusi Vatzmusai Nikra Sibas Kol Asibas. He said that the Eivishtas Mahus Vatzmus, he's called the Sibba of all the Sibbas. Shemimenu Nimtza Hakul. From him everything is Nimtza, is to be found. If he's the Sibba of everything, then what's the difference between the Sibba Rishona and the Sibba's Kol Asibas? He said, Uladaitom, and that's immediately what the Rebbe is going to warn us now. He said, Uladaitom, according to the Ramah and all those people who go with him, Efshe Tzorek Loi Makach. Maybe we could say like this. The Matziyusa is Barach in the very Matziyus of the Mahus of the Eibishter, Nimtzo Harotzen. Avaloishu Prinas Moker Chasper Sholem. In other words, why is the Eibishter called Sibas Kol Asibas? Because ultimately everything has to come from me. You can't all of a sudden have a Sibba Rishona and say, well, that's the Sibba Rishona, but the Eibishter, he's not anything with that. I mean, that's how convinced that this Rotzen or Kesser wouldn't really be the Eibishter's Rotzen, it would be the Rotzen, it would be a Rotzen in its own right, as it were. And it would be just completely divorced from the Eibishter. That you can't, obviously you can't say. So you have to say, that the Eibishter's Sibas Kol Sibas Kol Asibas. So the Rebbe said, what we have to say is that Lefi Shittosam Zicha in the Pshitas and in the absolute Avdollah of the Atzmas, there is to be found Aini, which is called Rotzen. But that Rotzen is so mudal and so mufshat that it's not called a mocker even to the Rotzen how it is in the Sibba HaRishona. In other words, that it all happens over there, and even from Kfitza Shaloiber Erech HaMadregas Klau, and that fits in with the word Sibba below. Like we point out, the word Sibba is comfortable in that respect. And that's Al Derech, we could say, by way of example, and Al Derech, we could say that that's Al Derech HaMavur because all these inyonim, one way or another, I mentioned these type of concepts occur in Pnimis HaTorah, brought down in Samachay, in the famous Hemshech of Rosh Hashanah in Samachay. And the truth is, it's also mentioned in the famous Maimah on Rosh Hashanah of the Mittler Rebbe. What's it called? The famous book, little book that the Mittler Rebbe wrote about Rosh Hashanah. Ateres Rosh, Yofi. Ateres Rosh. It's also brought down there in the Ateres Rosh. The Mittler Rebbe of in Samachay a little bit more kilo proteus abio, that we say that there is in the Atzmas himself, there's what we call over there a Rotzen Poshut, which is mitzad the Atzmas itself. It's a very amazing madrega what he calls over there, the Rotzen a Poshut she mitzad Atzmusa is born. It's a certain Indian, we could say, that even though they doesn't want that, and it's not really a mocker for anything at that particular point, but there's a certain mitzad, the shleimus of his atzmas, there's a certain Indian there of that rotzen as well, even though it's not shy to any yisoideres or any really wanting in any way, but it's killed there mitzad the shleimus of the atzmas. That is what the Mittler Rebbe does, and the Rebbe in Rashab in Samachay Mavaya does. And so that's like a sibur rechoika for a lower madreg in the rotzen, which is the first rotzen agolui koida matimtum v'chulu. We could say that that's what the Ramah Mipano V'taina, that in the Atzmus is kilu munach mitzad the Atzmus, a certain rotten portion she'ena beged a mokir cloud to anything, but it's like a sibur rechoike she'ilu lo yoyezeh lo yoyegili a rotten cloud afilu b'derech sibur rishoina, which is in the Keser. And that's what we'd have to say, that's what the Rebbe hints at here by saying that in the Metzius of the Atzmus is Barak Nimtza Harotzen, Avaloi B'Chinas Makor, it's not a Infana Amoka, I feel our Sibas are usually Amoka for their Mesuvavim, for their cause, that's a Sibba Ruchlecha B'Yesa, B'derach, Poshet Mitzad Pshitas Atzmus is Barak. It's all. Edifier. He said, that's what we have to say according to them. It'll be Muvan, the famous lesson that you say every day. Oh, well, not every day. Some of the Sfarim say it every day. What you say on every Friday, you say in the Posik Eliyahu. But since it's only once a week, on Friday you said it's probably being audacious to imagine that you guys remember it from one week to the other. But in the Posik Eliyahu, that you say on Friday afternoon, dort steht Antu Sibis Antu Elois Ilas Ha Elois Vesibas Ha Asibois. We call the Eivster, we say you are the Ila of all the Oruls, how do you call the Ilas Ha Elois, and you are the Sibas Ha Asibois. So it's Mavur, the Rebbe is going to mention it here in a minute. It's Mavur considers that Ilas Ha Elois, that's the first Ila, literally, but that's what we're talking about, the Mokir of Mamalik Olamin. In other words, Mamalik Olamin entires Madrega. Therefore, everything that goes from that, like we saw, is Lafi Erech Haruchni, as Yamamela, this is a Yinim Fanam Shocha B'derech Erech, and leads to a Stauselus Madrega and Madrega. Be'ilu Sibis Hatzibes. Yeah, that's the Abish now. He's the Mokir of Sibis, which are eating from Derech Rochik, and Derech Seiviv Kolam, and Derech Havdolah Shai Erech, and yet nonetheless we say, Antu, you are Sibis Hashibis. I already say he's Sibis Hashibis. That's what we were trying to support the Ramah. We say that even Mitzad the Atzmus is a Indian from a Matthias of Reish Shurotzen, yeah, B'teicha Atzmus Gamke.
Could you refer to the Atzmos as an Elul, though?
Yeah.
It says Elul of all Elulim. That's referring to the Atzmos?
Ilas HaIlas.
Yeah.
We just point out that's even from Mamalikol. That's a level of Mamalikol. How do you call that? That's easy square for us. The difficult one is Sibas HaSibas. Edifan. So says the Rebbe. That's the in according to the Ramah, Mipano, and the Mukubolim Harishim. Ochein, however, Haramak so Yimoin Bazeh. However, the Ramak, he ultimately will refuse to say this. Yimoin means he will refuse. V'sfira lei, and he is of the opinion, the Akushia, Eich loi shonisi, loi kasha midei. He said that the kasha how the Abish never had any shinui mitzad atzmose, loi kasha midei, that's not a kasha at all. As you all know, in the Gemara sometimes occurs that expression loi kasha midei, there's no kasha at all. Imi yois, hu atzmose is barak mamish siba harashoino. Even though we'll say that the Abish atzmose, let's call him siba harashoino. We can even call him the siba Harishoina, like the Ramah would call the Rotzen. Let's call the Abish Sibah Harishoina. He said, Hu rak b'pchinas seiv kol halmin, ve'ina mislabish v'nitvas b'toichom, v'loi k'may anishoma be'guf. V'lachin ein shum shinei boyes bar mibrias ha, v'elam hez. Tehamusuvav, ain't a poil shine ba siba. Oh, that's what we're looking for. So in other words, the Ramach, he says, after all, what's the whole problem? Let's say that what the Tikkun Isaiah onto Sibas HaSibas, referring to Atzmos to the Eibishter. And he's called the Sibah Rishoina. You don't have to make a difference between Sibah Rishoina and Nimtza Kolat Sibas. when I answer that. Let's say he's the Sibahara Arashoina. He said the difference between the concept of Ila v'Olav v'Ishtalshalas v'Chulu and the union from Sibah, that is enough. He said because a Sibah has no connection whatsoever with its Mesubah. And there's no kilo revealed error, even though mitzad the kavana aliyina v'chula, there might be some sort of a, things don't just cholila happen any old how. I mean, obviously there is a connection, but begolu in a form of error ain't co connection bein tela teh. And the fact the Rebbe Rashab brings down Beneged to Kriyas Yamsu. Sometimes you see that things just happen, some in. Or even Pili Ploys, Beliko Hachono, Beliko Kesha, Bein Zela Zeh, and it can be in a regular memory, Mami. Well, that is the answer to all the peoples. What they go around with long faces and they say, oh, you keep talking about the Geula and when's it going to happen and what's the problem about you turn back, leave the Geula alone, you're just driving people crying, let's just be, sort of unhappy and Madame Tussauds, and the whole thing. That's what they say. So the answer is that Ein Chanami, the Golas is terribly Orach, and there's a tremendous number of headaches with the Golas, and the whole thing is Mishugir in ways. In one split second, it can all alter and change and take you from Miyad, and that's what the Rebbe says, Rega ke memory. And it's not just that the Rebbe says, state in Shulchan Aruch, you guys probably learn it either in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch or in the somebody Shulchan Aruch. It's written again in Atilas Yadayim, for example, the Suda. One of the reasons we do that because of the infant Strach Truma. It's really because of the Kohanim. They're to blame for the whole thing. We're not Kohanim. But we have to wash our hands because Shema, the Alter Rebbe brings the Shema Yibona Beis HaMikdash. And immediately after you wash your hands, or the next time you come to wash your hands, there will already be a Beis HaMikdash, and everybody's going to have to wash their hands in order to eat Truma. The sages made a gezerah that you have to wash your hands before you eat Truma. And that's the whole reason we make Natilas Yadayim L'Suda. And who's going to have to do that? The Kohanim. Ordinary people are not going to be eating Truma. I say ordinary people, I mean, Yidden are not going to be eating Truma. So the Tzadinian is no to leave Kohanim, and it's no because Shema Yibona Beis HaMikdash take of Miyad Mami. I mean, they state in Shulchan Aruch. The Alter Rebbe brings it up in Hilchos Natilas Yadayim. He was any second, anything can happen, and it all depends on you. If you really believe and kochset that it's going to happen, then ain't a. And the Rebbe brings in the Rebbe Rashab brings in Tov Reish Nun Ches. It's another Hemshech altogether. That was the year that they said he was very ill. That year, and you should look at some of the greatest chidushim hidden in that sefer in Tov Reish Nun Ches. You'll see all of them say, but they give you back to earlier Maimonim in the Marim Mekim. They go back to that sefer one way or another, and they said that year that he was terribly ill. As he stayed, upon him. So the Rebbe Rashab writes over there at Kriyas Yamsu, he came and stood in front of the mitzvah just a few kilometers behind, and this huge sea in the way where, what are we doing? Said it, the whole thing's ending. And then we had all these Marish Clear niggas, they said, let's go back, and others said, let's jump into the sea, and others said, we're trying to make a mechama, and doing it. And the Rebbe said nobody really thought of the emer's answer. Just keep going. Keep going. I just walk into the sea. And all of a sudden, that's exactly what Machshon ben Aminadav did. He just went into the sea, and then boom, all of a sudden, this is huge, unbelievable, and that's called Kriyas Yamsu. The Rebbe says no error between them. He put his foot into the water. He jumped into the water. It's that got to do with Pnimis Atik. Ich weiß mit Ruhe. He's erg, ich would say. Pnimis Atik. It was for a kesher. Hat shum kesher. And didn't really need to be there. He kept marking on them. He was the one that didn't show us have a part in Kriyas Yamsu, and that's what he gave over in the Shir Kloli last week, B'Shem Maral Mipra. is a Yisoid Niflo, Venera, what the Maral puts down, that ain't no Chanami. Everything in a Nes Amiti for the Avish is the Avish, and not the Mensch. But the Mensch has to do something, so they bear a cloud, because the Avish wants Israel to something there in the net. Remember, the Rebbe says, believe. The Rebbe says, go out and put tefillin on another, you do it. Could be that that's exactly what we're waiting for. Mir der was ein wir zu tun. Aber mir das in von Zibbe, das Zeit Zibbe sa. Das Zeit Zibbe sa Zibbe. Der Vater Ramak, der had ik der Ramak, he said, was it the kasha? You can call the Avish Zibbe Harishon. He said, because anyway, Zibbe is completely rochik from the Mesua, ain't by name kasha. He said, it's not like the neshama inside the guf. The neshama is not a sibba for the chayes of the guf. So the neshama enters the body and this mislavish because also it's like a form of ha'ila and ha'olov. It's not but the sibba or masuba. Well, auch ein shum shinoi boyes barak me briyas ha'ilmas. The amasuvav ain't a poil shinoi ba'asiba because the effect doesn't cause any change in the cause. In other words, cause and effect are rechikim zeh. He said, so I afresh pain ilas ha'ilos l'sibas ha-sibay. The ilas ha'ilos, they're ha'olom poil shinui ba'olom. Avo sibas ha-sibays, ein ha-masuva poil shinui. And the Father Ramah says, call him the sibba, like Patlikla. Call him sibba harashain. The first cause. He said the etymology from Sibba is indicative of what he called Seiv Kalalmi. Seiv Kalalmi is ein bezeh kol shayches v'kesher. He was ein bezeh kol is pilas belavach. Ve'im kein hu Sibas kola Sibba. In Mamela, the Eibishter Sibas kola Sibba. O begin sauer am islabish mamish poelames. Yeah, what about the Inif and the Mamali? Yeah, the Mamali does go down and does undergo the Inif Shinuim and Madrigas, Ve'ilas Ha'ilos, but the guns who do it. He said there is a Shinui Matadama Mamali, there is Shinuim and his pilots Matadama Mamali. So therefore he said, no, the Ramak would answer that one also. The Ramak would have a way out of that. Gamkein. He said, begin sa'er ha-mislabish mamish poelamas hu rak mebchinas dvar avaya shehu ha'orech hitzayne she'im poel shum shenikan. He said, even mitzad the mamale, what it looks at there would be his pilas, lav davke that would be his pilas afilu mitzad zeh. Elama? He said, because the Indian is only dibble, like we were married in the previous part of the Hamshire, the dibble is the Indian from Chitzayne's bill. Bilvad. The Ramak's got a very good policy, and he's got a very good case, the Ramak, that he's not affected by the fact that you call the Avish a Sibba. I wanted to give him from Mamali Kolam in Dorte, the Shinuim. You said, no, even they don't have to say the Shinuim, because we take the Bechina Ki Achreina, where that's a Dini from Tibum from them, the Avish to make some Mamali Kolam. Well, you have to put him a Gala Dini from Mamali. Here we find an amazing thing. When you first look at the Ramak, he seems to be Mamish Rochik with Divrei Achsidus Beklal. And all of a sudden the Rebbe's made him the Davki of the Ramak. He can find, which are Martimim, L'shittas Achsidus Be'al Rebbe's Pili place. And that's in effect what the Alter Rebbe said. Because the Alter Rebbe said that there's no Shinui even in the Ur Mamali. That's what the Alter Rebbe said. There's no Shinui even in the Ur Mamali. From which, because it's all from a Bechina Hakri Chitzonius, Vaki Achreina, where it's called the Inif Tibur. That's what he starts off in Tanya. Perikov, take a look and you'll see. At the Elder was an Shinui Boyes Borov, Loi Bachtusai, Mipnei Shebedvar Havaya Shomayim Nas. The whole thing is only Dibur. Dibur is Nishkashina, Afil Bechina Siv Slapsha. It's not a Slapsha Samitia. I stayed Perikov. You look at Perikov, the whole thing, it's fallen on a Tanya. It's like the Tereshubik Sachav. It's like the Chimish. It's like everything in Tanya is little sort of words, Later on you start to, you learn a whole piece and says, wait a minute, isn't that written in Tanya? You look up and you see the Alter Rebbe said it in about 5 the words over there. They state that it's the same thing here. Ja, shein boy poil shinu canal. Behil bier bozer. Yeah, so by saying all this, the Ramak, he earned. In other words, he got into a good situation. He earned, but with that, shein tzorich loima sheim ain't safe. Zulas al mahusi vatzmusi barak levad. You don't have to say the term ain't safe, but that means all these unbelievable shlilas kol shlilas and shlilas kol toyadim and all those in yonim that we saw was in for ain't safe. Only vatzmusi is barak levad. And these Mukvarim Shainim, they wanted to say that no, the Ein Sof is more better on something which is already only Olum, not Mahuzi Vatzmusi Hizbora. Yeah. Because they didn't want Mahuzi Vatzmusi Hizbora to be involved. So there was by without saying what they said, you can still say that Mahuzi Vatzmusi Hizbora is not involved. So therefore he said the Ramak earns a very good way without getting into this whole problem of Kadman Kikadmusa. The Gamein Tzorich Loim Rotzen Kodum Chas V'Sholem. Here the Rebbe puts in a Chas V'Sholem, even though he said earlier that was the beer in the Ramah Mipano. Now he writes Gamein Tzorich Loim Rotzen Kodum Chas V'Sholem. Ki hu levade akadmein v'hu levade b'chinas o'ein seifo amiti de'ein loi t'chila v'ein loi tichlo. He doesn't have any beginning, he doesn't have any finality. B'chinas b'lig v'hu bi emes. He said, "V'chein hu ha'emes kenhau." The Rebbe said that sof kol sof. If you think carefully about the Ramah, then you come to the conclusion that that is really ultimately there. At the emes, even though the Alter Rebbe's got certain slight differences from the Ramah, in certain concepts, but when I get to the inim from Atzmusai and the lack of any necessity to involve Atzmusai in the Etzem Abriya, that the Alter Rebbe and the Ramak are all b'chad shitosa. U'biyemesh shederech zu shel Ramak nechoina u'slula yoter. Oh, you see that? The Rebbe says that this way of the Ramak is more correct and it's more, well paved. The word salul means well paved, well paved out. You call when they make a new crease, they put pavement. They put down. You make a road. Smooth. Asphalt.
Smooth.
Yeah. Well, they make it out of
Tar.
Tar. That's what it is. Whatever. That's called derech slula. Solila tadir. Mamela, he said that. Therefore, the Ramak, the way that the Ramak has is nachoina uslula yoter. Shief shaloim aklal inyan rotzen kodum. The Rebbe is now getting sharp a bit with the Ramah. He said you can't really say this whole inyan of rotzen kodum. The Miyachish is prinas matzias dovo. You see, that's what we've been pointing out the whole time. When you say the word rotzen, you automatically imply a certain inyan with the rotzen is rotzeh. So that's already a certain matzias, because you always say they actually wanted it, that he's giving it a certain importance of something. It's already kilo, or if he's being megal a koyach that would eventually want that, then that koyach which is being megal, which might eventually want a certain thing, has already become a guided inyan. It has some sort of a matzias. Therefore, you can't very well say something which is a matzias. You can't very well say. How can we say that it's primordial and it's in from Kadman? The Meyachish is beginnes Matthias Dover, she'ena beginnes Atzmas, eik noima al zeh shehu kadum chas b'sholem. Shezeu eino shayech ki'im al Atzmas v'loy al zu losei. Only on the Atzmas and not on anything to be considered apart from him. And Mamil said the Rebbe Imkain, the Ramak, has got a very basically defensible and well-trodden path. Imkain, B'chinas HaRotzen, Sha'eno Atzmas, v'hu nimtzo min ha'atzmas, eich noima al zeh kadum chas v'sholim. So we see that ultimately the Rebbe, to a certain extent, defends himself from the Shitta of the Ramak. As you might call, he is to use the expression in the modern Hebrew, hu mistayeg mizeh. He sort of frances himself somewhat from it, and he even uses the expression, ultimately, chasver sholem, that it's difficult very much to say that. He said, the gam boyer ein seishel, now tzimtzum, yeah, b'meh sheshayach loima, b'chinas alois harotzen, hu mechudash, that the Rebbe says that even if we take lifnei tzimtzum, and in Samadrega, where we do already begin to talk about the rotzen appearing, he said it's a new thing, it's a mechudash, it's a new, what you call produced entity, that you can't say on primordial Madrega is the word ratzon. Because a ratzon is always like a new in it. And that's the whole concept of ratzon. Ratzon means that there's something which is going to add now to a new situation which Kilo wasn't there before. That's why you want. The basic concept of ratzon implies that a new situation has arisen. Therefore, he said the whole concept of ratzon is what we call a inyan mechudash. It's like a new inyan, which the Eibishter mitatamim hayeduim lo yizbarach is allowing to be revealed. He said if it's a inyan for mechudash, then it's not the inyan for kodum kadmusa yizbarach. It's not mamish shleimus akadmus of the atzmas. And therefore he said, "Come to us, eik noimal ze kodum." He said, even in what we talk about, lifnei atzimtzum, where it is shaykh somewhat to say the going up and the occurrence of the rotzim, then it's a mechudash. K'may kein hu b'klos b'chinas oyer. Even what the Alter Rebbe time is oyer, shehu mechudash. V'hainu shehu nimtza mimenu u'b'ritzeina idavke, oy behechreach chasve sholem. Im kein u'k'moy shekodmeya heder. Even the oil, what the Alter Rebbe talks about, is also a mechudash. It's something which wasn't always there. If it wasn't always there, then it's kodmei ha-heder. It preceded it the absence of its own self. As if it had a point where it wasn't, and then it comes about, then it's a mechudash. And remember, that's what we're going to see as we go along. That's the unbelievable chiddush of the Alter Rebbe. That even though the oil is kodmei ha-heder, the oil is takiyam adova mechudash. The emphasis that's the from there. Nonetheless, in that oil is nimta the koyak of the Ein Tov, not the Ein Tov, but the koyak of the Ein Tov is nimta mamish in the oil. Mitzad mi ein amoer, or ki ein amoer. I should know the Gerritz Hakodesh, and that is the greatness. What about Kodmei Heder? You want Kodmei Heder? Let's go back into the Yechilas, into Od Madregas, in Klulim B'Teicha Atzmas, not Mamish Atzmas. Then we'll be able to say Kodmei Heder. We'll see the unbelievable koyach of the Alter Rebbe. So the other day, it's on Shabbos, I was in a shul in Bnei, and I said that the Rebbe said that all of our Rebbeim were Nevi'im. They were like the koyach, the chiddush of the koyach hanavua. Comes up to me a Polish guy and he said, it's a bit much. Say all the Chabad Rebbeim were Nevi'im. I mean, he wasn't choylik, I'll say. He was just a bit tight like that. So I said, listen. I said, you just really study the Alter Rebbe. The trouble is, we don't know anything about the Rebbe. We just know a bit what the Alter Rebbe is all about. I said, you study, you go into the Emes Inyanim of the Alter Rebbe, and you'll see that his koyach in Torah is the koyach hanavua. It's not shaykh otherwise. It's only the inyan from Gilui Soid Hashem Lenaviyot. So I'm telling you that this whole business here, and the Alter Rebbe is machriya between all these unbelievable madregas, and he owns all the things that are and he owns them all, and he brings them in such a way that they're all makes this unbelievable doctrine of the Me'ein Hamoy, what it has to do with. I'd like to leave you with a slightly controversial bedtime, whatever, of course, Damar and a few other inyanim. It's but that's the inyan, and that's all in an even for Nebuah. Now, I'm not saying that the other great Mukabalim weren't, but Ruach HaKodesh, of the famous one on of the famous Kulvos, to which is higher Ruach HaKodesh on Nebuah. So the Rebbe Rashab says in a place that Nebuah is higher than Ruach HaKodesh. that Nevuah is higher than Ruach HaKodesh, because Nevuah is the highest possible, and it comes down B'tachlis into the proof of itself in Metzias Mamish Kipshuteh. Ruach HaKodesh is a higher, more Helam Dikitah. V'yin kana machon l'harich, b'chol ma'ela v'yesh l'harich, and Derike Yechia Melech Hama Mashiach.
Rabbi, can I ask a question? I've heard you say this before, that all the Kabbalah Gerim with the Nevi'im. So this question came up in my mind when we were doing Siyum Rambam. So Rambam said the Nevuahs are going to come back to the Jewish people right before the times of Mashiach. The whole Torah was 200 years ago.
So my dear sir, you should realize that the Baal Shem Tov, and even the great tzaddikim in historian prior to the Baal Shem Tov, they all said that now is the moment for the Gilui of Mashiach. And why doesn't it come? All of them, the Pe'echot, have all been saying that yes, the time. And in the famous Sikh in Toshin Nun Aleph, Pasha Shaitim, the Rebbe writes over there that the Ike revelation of the Indian for Nevuah was with the Baal Shem Tov Atomic. They state that. But the Rebbe says that the truth of the matter is that there was never a time when there weren't Nevi'im. Because if you look in the Rambam carefully, you see the Rambam doesn't say that there was ever really a time when there weren't Nevi'im. It's not necessary to say that. That just that there were certain times when the Nevuah is more Behelim, it's at the Metzias of the Olam. But the Etzemini for Nevuah is always there. And over the Rebbe brings in that city, you look right near the end of the famous Mari Mokim from the Rebbe Pele Dikizak, but the Rambam brings in one of the Balei HaTosefos, one of the great teachers of the Tosefos at the time of the Tosefos. What was he called? Somebody else, Sagi Nohor. He was blind. He couldn't actually, he didn't know the Koyach Hariyah Hagashmi, yes. There was written about him that the Balei HaTosefos said about him that he was a Novi. They said the Hoyaloi Nevuah. And the Rambam writes in the Geras Taimon, or the Geras Tchizanit in the Geras Taimon. The Rambam writes before, he said, B'yomov, there was a Novi. The Rambam says there was a person that he says he was a Novi.